Good afternoon everybody. Today we are going to be taking a dive into r/NuclearRevenge. This story is going to be crazy. I hope you guys enjoy, and if you did, give a like button and share the video. I'll see you guys at the end. You were never my dad. Back in the mid-90s my sister got knocked up by a guy. She was 17. He was 18. I despise the guy with pretty much every fiber of my being. My mom decided, however, that a baby should know their father, so she invited him to come live in our house without telling me. Took me a week to calm down enough so that when I eventually came back I didn't punch him when I walked in the door. John was a piece of shit, great artistic talent, but all he did all day was sit out in the garage and do prison tats for people, in addition to stealing mine and my deceased father's power tools and pawning them for a few bucks so he could get some cigarettes. I worked a full-time job and went to school, so I would be gone 12 to 14 hours a day, but it felt like I was pulling into the driveway of a frat house with a dozen or so people drinking and partying in the garage until I had to leave in the morning. I slowly curtailed that shit by being a giant pain in the ass to all the guests, by having their cars towed or their wheels inexplicably slashed. By the time my nephew was 2, I'd managed to put a stop to the 24-hour party zone, but people would still congregate on Saturdays. A few months later I'd had enough and threw John to the curb. My sister's friends all came forward to tell her about how he'd hit on all of them and probably slept with half of them, plus some other skanks he'd meet, all the while professing his devotion to my sister and their child. After I'd thrown him out, John disappeared for 8 years. No idea where, and I really didn't care. Then came a court summons for a custody hearing. John was suing for custody. However, in the 8 years since he disappeared, my sister had met a guy and they'd gotten married. My nephew was formally adopted by his stepdad and changed his legal name. The first hearing was dismissed because the allegations made as the basis for the custody hearing were investigated by CPS and decided as having no substance. In fact, nephew wasn't beaten, abused, or neglected. House wasn't a disaster and in danger of falling apart, nor was it a health threat. Every few months John would file another custody hearing request until it finally got a date. John made a number of allegations, all of which were disproven by documentation and fact. Finally, the judge decided he'd had enough and called my 10-year-old nephew up and asked him who he wanted to live with. I don't know him. He walked out of my life when I was 2. He's not my dad, is my dad, and he, John, will never be my dad, and I don't ever want to see him again. The judge ruled against John and dismissed his custody request with prejudice. When I looked at John, he was sobbing in his chair as his mother comforted him. I sneered at him and flipped him off as I walked out of the courtroom. As to why John was missing for 8 years, apparently he'd been committed to a mental facility in Tennessee, and when he got out years later he went on SSI disability and then plotted various ways to hurt me, my sister, and my mom once he got out. He'd called CPS on us, made a number of anonymous complaints about drugs and guns, and even called the fire department a time or two. The custody hearing was meant to be the culminating event, but fortunately John was an idiot, and we had enough money to hire a good attorney. A few years later John tried to mend some fences with my nephew and invited him to come down to where he lived and meet his relatives, including a half-brother my nephew didn't even know he had. My nephew also has a half-sister, but her mother deliberately excluded John from the birth certificate. This is in addition to the half-brother and sister he has from his mom and adoptive father. Needless to say, my nephew was not terribly impressed by his relatives. Now my nephew and brother-in-law are some serious rednecks, and they both love guns, hunting, camping out, and generally living the redneck lifestyle, but apparently John and his family took it to some serious extremes. There's a photo I saw one time on the internet with some guy sitting on a toilet on his front porch, and I imagine John and his extended family live something like that, only seriously and not done as an internet joke. Considering the area, I would not be surprised. When my nephew was 15, almost 16, we received a call that John was dead. Someone had put a gun to the back of his head and blown his brains out as he sat on the couch in his mobile home. I felt sorry for John's girlfriend and her son, who found him, but for John I didn't feel a thing. A journalist tracked my nephew down a few months later and filled us in on some details. Apparently John had been killed as a result of a murder-for-hire plot. We learned through our own sources that John had been dealing drugs and unknowingly moved into someone else's territory. The would-be drug kingpin paid a guy a few $100 and the promise of an ATV to kill John. Typical redneck retribution, I guess. The journalist asked my nephew for a quote. "Sure. I wish I could meet the man who killed him." "Why is that?" the journalist asked. "So I could shake his hand. John was never my dad, and I won't miss him." I got to questions 1. Why did you say you hated him in the first paragraph? The way you made it sound was that you only hated him because he got your sister pregnant. I can understand that he was most likely a few months older than her, making it illegal, but it's a less than a year difference. It's like the bullshit that went down in my school when my friend dated a girl a year younger than him and got called a pedophile and a rapist. 2. Why did you slash their tires? Based on the story it just sounded like they were hanging out with a friend. I can understand having them towed as they had to break some parking law or shit to have it happen. But slashing the tires of some people hanging out with someone you don't like is the equivalent of going after someone's family to get to them. I know it's not the same level, but I'm trying to make a point that, based on what you wrote, they were just hanging out with a friend. 1. Getting my sister pregnant was enough, but he also gave off a really scummy vibe. Part of it could also be tribal. I was the alpha male, and he was intruding on my territory. I didn't want him there, told him as much, and then he plopped his ass down and proceeded to leech off my mom and annoy the shit out of me with his mere presence. 2. I was a delivery driver for Lowe's at the time, and on Saturdays during the summer I would regularly put in 11-hour days. I had no problem with a couple people coming over, but when there are 12 cars and 20 some people it's a bit much. I only had one rule: don't park in the driveway. And if you do park in the driveway and I get home and honk my horn, move your fucking car now. Instead, I was cussed out and told off. So I sliced tires and would make a pithy comment when my handiwork was discovered. Also, the cars weren't actually breaking any laws, but they were on my yard. I could legally have them towed whenever I wanted. Hell, I did it on Christmas Eve one year when our neighbor across the street had a party and all their friends parked in my yard despite asking them not to and to move the ones that were parked there. I was sitting in a lawn chair with my coat on, a blanket over my lap, and a thermos of hot chocolate in hand waiting for the fun. They did not disappoint. It wasn't an issue next year or any year after. When I was younger I freely admit to being a grade A asshole, and I wouldn't have had any regret going after someone's family to get to them. I was big, mean, and barely able to contain a violent temper. I'm a lot calmer these days, but I could have easily gone down a different path. That story was absolutely crazy. He definitely deserved what came to him. Goodbye and good riddance. The next story is gonna be a nice and short story from r/PettyRevenge about an grandpa. If you guys enjoy, hit the like button. On to the final story. Grumpy uncle gets what he deserves. So we have this holiday in Germany called Pfingsten, and within my family there is a tradition for a nice get together, some BBQ and a fun ping pong tournament. Everyone participates in it, even my nearly 90-year-old grandma, who is kinda sporty. Unfortunately my one uncle is also invited, who is very grumpy paressy, complaining about everything, and giving snappy answers if you bother to try to start a conversation with him. This year's ping pong tournament saw an odd number of participants, so that at the end of a round someone had to play a second game for this round without the possibility to earn points. At the end of round it was my duty to play this extra round, and guess what? It was against my grumpy uncle. By this time I had performed quite well, and my uncle had only losses. So I headed to the ping pong table with the intent to let him win the game, causing no harm to anyone. I was not even really there, and far from ready, and my uncle serves the first ball. I catch it mid-air, unaware that the game had started already. He immediately throws some choice words into my direction. Gone were my good intentions and I crushed him 11-0. Oh, happy holidays. Whoa, you made it to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to hit that like button. Try sharing the video with your dog or your arch nemesis. I hope you have a good day. I'll see you soon.